Hello, I'm Reverend Scott Wipperman, pastor here at First Presbyterian Church in Helena, Montana, and we welcome you to our worship service today. I'd like you to know that regardless of who you are or where you are in your journey of faith, you're welcome here at First Presbyterian Church. Our New Testament reading comes from the Gospel of Luke, the 16th chapter. And Jesus tells us this parable. There was a rich man who was dressed in purple and fine linen and lived in luxury every day. At his gate was laid a beggar named Lazarus, covered with sores, and longing to eat what fell from the rich man's table. Even the dogs came and licked his sores. The time came when the beggar died, and the angels carried him to Abraham's side. The rich man also died and was buried. In Hades, where he was in torment, he looked up and saw Abraham far away with Lazarus by his side. So he called to him, "Father Abraham, have pity on me, and send Lazarus to dip the tip of his finger in water to cool my tongue, because I'm in agony in this fire." But Abraham replied, "Son, remember that in your lifetime you received your good things, while Lazarus received bad things. But now he is comforted here, and you are in agony. And beside all this, between us and you is a great chasm has been set in place, so that those who want to go from here to you cannot, nor can anyone cross over from there to us." He answered, "Then I beg you, Father, send Lazarus to my family, for I have 5 brothers. Let him warn them, so that they will not also come to this place of torment." Abraham replied, "They have Moses and the prophets. Let them listen to them." "No, Father Abraham," he said, "but if someone from the dead goes to them, they will repent." And he said to them, "If they do not listen to Moses and the prophets, they will not be convinced, even if someone rises from the dead." The word of the Lord. When in seminary, you learn several different approaches for crafting a sermon. And one of those approaches is called the 4 moves of the sermon. It starts out with you point out the trouble in the text. And then you make a move and you point out trouble in our present day life that relates to that trouble in the text. And the third move then is to go back to the text and find the good news in the text, God's redeeming power in the text. And then the fourth move is to bring that back into our world and find the redeeming power, God's presence, God's good news in our world. So if we look at Jesus' parable today, in the first move we do have trouble in the text, don't we? The rich man, dressed in purple and blue, those were colors that only the wealthy could afford and wear. He dies, and he goes to Hades. And he's longing for even a finger dipped in some water to cool his tongue. But that cannot happen. And he calls to Abraham and says, "At least, Abraham, warn my 5 brothers. Tell them not to follow the path that I followed that led me to this place. Tell them to depart from that path and find a different path." For the rich man was a very self-centered person, caring only about himself. There's a good chance that his vision never crossed Lazarus laying at his gate. It was always focused on him and what he wanted and needed. Well, there's trouble in our time too, right? Unfortunately, self-centeredness and selfishness didn't go away somewhere in the last 2,000 years. It's still here today. I don't know if you saw, there's a new TV show out called The Good Place. It started this week, and the episode opens up with this woman kind of coming to in a reception area. And suddenly some man comes to the doors to the reception area and invites her into his office and explains that she has died and she is now in the good place. And she asks, "Is this heaven?" And he goes, "Well, this is the good place. There's the bad place, but this is the good place. You made it to the good place." And he goes on to tell her that you get to the good place because during your life, a tally is kept. And all the bad things you do are negatives in your tally. And all the good things you do are positives in your tally. And so your overall number will move up and down as you do these things. And it's not just that if your number is above 0, you get to go to the good place. Because Michael, the curator of the good place, goes on to say that only those with really big positive numbers come to the good place. Now, this is pretty lousy theology, but it makes for a good TV series. And so this woman is shown to her new home where she lives here in this wonderful place. Everybody in the good place has a soulmate, and she's introduced to her soulmate, who just happens to be a philosophy professor that studied ethics and morals. Well, as time goes on, we realize it finally comes out from this young woman that she shouldn't be here. They got her name right, but they didn't. They got what she did wrong. They told her that she had been a lawyer that had freed innocent people off of death row, that she'd gone to third world countries and helped people with their legal problems there, but that wasn't her. She was this selfish, self-centered person who was a very good salesperson selling worthless supplements to senior citizens. She made a lot of money at that. And there's episodes, we flash back to her life before she died, and she was very self-centered with the way she dealt with her friends. And when you come back into the good place, she's still acting very selfish and self-centered there. And finally winds up asking her soulmate, this professor, could he teach her how to be good? Because she really needs it. And unfortunately, like I say, that person that's personified in this TV show, The Good Place, we bump in all too often in the world, right? So there's trouble here. We still have trouble with being self-centered, self-oriented, selfish at times. Well, the third move is to look at the grace in the text, to look at the good news, the redeeming thing. And in this parable, well, there isn't any good news, is there? I mean, here's the rich man. He's stuck down in Hades, can't get out because there's this giant chasm that prevents him from going. And he asks for a messenger to be sent to his brothers. And Abraham tells him that, well, if your brothers don't listen to Moses and to the prophets, they're not going to listen to even a dead man that we send back to them. So we're kind of stuck. There's no good news for this third move. But in our present day, there is someone who has come back from the dead to warn us. The ghost of Marley Jacobs has come to talk to Scrooge about his self-centered ways, that he's a lousy, miserly person. Yes, he comes and he tells them many things which I don't remember all of, so let me read some of them. He comes dragging this long chain and says, I wear this chain I forged in life. I made it link by link and yard by yard. Would you recognize the weight and length of the strong coil you bear yourself? And after a little discussion, the ghost gets very agitated. And he says, mankind was my business. The common welfare was my business. Charity, mercy, forbearance, and benevolence were all my business. The dealings of my trade were but a drop of water in the comprehensive ocean of my business. And the ghost concludes his visit with Scrooge, telling him, offering him a chance and a hope, that he will be visited by 3 spirits, that this is his chance and hope. And as we know from the story, Ebenezer Scrooge does listen ultimately to the ghost and to the spirits that come and see him. And in that final scene with the last spirit, the spirit of the future, he pleads with the spirit and asks, are these the shadows of the things that will be? Or are they the shadows of the things that may be only? Men's courses will foreshadow certain ends, to which, if preserved in, they must lead. But if the courses be departed from, the ends will change. Say it is thus. And the next morning, when Scrooge awakens, he departs from his courses, and the ends do change. When confronted with the wrong that we've done, do we not want a hope and a chance? The hope and chance that was offered to Scrooge, do we not hope that we will get something like that? But this is a novel, right? This is fiction. But there was another dead man who came back to talk to us. In our reading with Timothy this morning, Timothy talks to us. Paul was talking to Timothy at this point and giving him advice. So Paul talks to us, and he says, those who want to get rich fall into temptation, a trap, and into many foolish and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. Now it's interesting. Neither in Timothy or in Luke, they don't condemn money, but they certainly do give us warnings about wealth, right? How do we look at the wealth do we have? Do we see that we are good stewards of this wealth, or do we just try to justify our wealth? Because we generally think of wealth as security, right? But wealth has many temptations and traps, as Paul said. And if we ease our way into wealth, maybe we ease our way into and through these temptations and traps and don't really notice them as we're going along the way. But if wealth comes suddenly, or if there's a promise of sudden wealth, then the onslaught of these temptations and traps becomes a little bit easier to see. The Texas Lottery Commission did a study a couple years ago of the winners of a lot of money in the lottery. And they found that, on average, after 18 months, all of the money was gone. Now, surely there were some that were good stewards of that money and did something and used it for good purposes. But if that is the case, then there must have been many more who lost it all before even 18 months. With this sudden onslaught of money, they fell into temptations, into traps, and squandered it away. And how about inheritances? All of us know of and maybe have personal experience with siblings torn apart over an inheritance, of accusations or realities of one scheming to get a bigger share of the pie, of fights over how to divide up physical assets that are left that aren't easily portioned out. There's an interesting story about a very wealthy man. He was a widower at this point in time of his life. He had hundreds of millions of dollars in wealth, and he had 4 children. And at one point in time, he invites the children to come along with their lawyers to his house. And he lays out his will before them. He says, I want to do this now so that you'll know what's coming, so there won't be any fighting when I'm done, when I'm gone. And then he asked the children and the lawyers to sign documents stating that he is of sound mind to make this will and testament, and that this is his will. And they sign those documents as he is signing and dating this will. And the children depart dreaming of the tens and tens of millions that they're going to inherit when their father passes away. And after the children have left, the next day, the widower goes with his lawyer and pulls out another will to supersede the will that was signed the day before, that he had prepared in advance. Because, see, we know from the story that he thinks his children are selfish and petty, and he doesn't have any trust that they would do good with the inheritance that they would receive, that they'd be good stewards of this. He feels that they would just squander it on temptations and traps. And so he signs this new will, which gives everything he has to a non-family member that he believes would be a good steward. And he invited all his children there the day before so that they could attest that he was in sound mind and would be unable to contest this will when he did finally pass. Wealth can do strange things to us, lead us into traps and into temptations. That is what we are being warned about. And there's nothing wrong with money. Money's neither good nor bad, like I told the children. It's just, what do we do with it? Do we ensure some way that we are good stewards of the wealth that we have, this gift that we've been given? Because it's not really ours, is it? We are just temporary holders of this wealth. We are just to be good stewards of this wealth. But we need to ensure that wealth, if we have it, doesn't obscure our vision, like the rich man in the parable whose vision looked right over Lazarus at his front gate and didn't even see him out there. We need to make sure that our wealth doesn't prevent us from seeing the Lazaruses laying at our gates, that our wealth doesn't prevent us from seeing those working poor who rely on food stamps to put food on their table. That our wealth doesn't prevent us from seeing the refugee who is fleeing fighting in her country, looking only for a safe place to live. That our wealth doesn't interfere with our vision to see the lonely. That our wealth doesn't prevent us from seeing those that have been cast aside by society, or that have been bullied or humiliated or put down. This is what Paul is talking about. He tells Timothy, command those who are rich in this present world not to be arrogant or to put their hope in wealth, which is so uncertain, but to put their hope in God, who richly provides us with everything for our enjoyment. Command them to do good, to be rich in good deeds, and to be generous and willing to share. As I said earlier, there's this other dead man who comes back to warn us not to follow the rich man's path in this parable. Does this dead man get our attention? These are my words that I spoke to you while I was still with you, that everything written about me in the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms must be fulfilled. The Messiah is to suffer and to rise from the dead on the third day, and that repentance and forgiveness of sins is to be proclaimed in his name to all nations. Is that enough for us? Are we convinced? Is our attention grabbed? Is this where our focus will be? Because it isn't about us. The one returned from dead did so to tell us that he is for all nations. That he is for the rich man and for Lazarus, the Canaanite woman, her daughter, for wayward sons that are still not home, and those sons that have never left home. We are called not to indulge in the sweet scent of self-love. We're to follow the fragrance of the one whose feet were anointed by the sinful woman. I'm certain this will lead us to the hungry, and that all will be fed in body and in soul. The Gospel of Luke didn't end with this parable about the rich man and Lazarus. We know the ending. We know what happened. And that is the third move of the sermon, the good news that Christ proclaims about forgiveness, no matter where we are off the path, about his love and his grace. And this is also the fourth move of the sermon, because that grace is present in this time and day. That love is here, that forgiveness is here. There is abundant love. There is abundant grace. That the brothers and sisters will listen to this dead man. That there's no chasm so wide that we can't cross it. That this dead man can't bring us across that chasm. Because he rose from the dead, and he forgives sins, and he calls us all by name. That there is a chance and a hope for each and every one of us. A chance and a hope, if we will but walk away from our paths that were like the rich man's or like Scrooge's, and fall onto the path that Christ leads us to. Because once our past paths are departed from, the ends will change.